Now, what I wanted to do, since we Facebook lived this particular segment to our listening audience, I wanted to mention this now to our radio audience about Martin Luther King Jr. And we brought to the forefront on Saturday something that needed to be brought to the forefront. I was asked to come on Joe Kane's show. I'm going to give a little bit of back narrative right now of something that happened in 2014.
Right.
2014, myself and Joe Kane and the Guardian Angels, as well as Jerome Taylor, we brought to light a story of a house that Martin Luther King Jr. very well may have lived in. And there was a little bit of evidence that he may have lived there in one summer. And we brought it to light. Apparently, the backstory was there was an individual who had pictures on the mantle of Martin Luther King Jr. and himself in that house. And there was a little bit of a narrative that, yeah, he lived here. And come to find out, he probably didn't. He very well may have stayed in the home here and there. Very similar to what the other house is that's now at the forefront. And that new house has gotten a lot of press over the last 2.5 years. And there is an individual, I'm not going to mention his name, but he brought that home to light. And he was in the process of determining whether or not Martin Luther King Jr. had lived there. And he created a whole bunch of evidence and things and to support the theory that Martin Luther King Jr. did live there. Now, come to find out, all of this information was then given to Stanford University for authenticity or authentication. And Stanford University said there was too many conflicting stories, and they saw no historic impact. And there is a little bit of a backstory as well, because while he was living at that home, there was an incident in Maple Shade, and that incident was he actually went to Mary's Cafe, which happened to be a bar at the time, after 10 o'clock on a Sunday. And the bar owner there refused him service. And according to the bar owner, he refused him service because it was after 10 o'clock and blue laws did not allow him to serve him. And it was not only Sunday, but it was after 10 o'clock. So there were two effective reasons why he could not serve him. Now, what Martin Luther King and the two people who he was with created a little bit of a stir, and as to why they weren't serving him, and the bar owner got a little worried about the commotion that was ensuing. Now, the narrative, according to Martin Luther King Jr., actually his name was Michael King at the time.
Yes. And
that is what is in the police report, as a matter of fact. But what happened was they created a stir. The bar owner was a little worried, of the raucous that was ensuing. So he went out and shot a gun into the air to alert officials about the raucous that was going on in his bar. Now, at that time, you had no 911.
Right.
You did not have the phone service that you have right now, and that was effectively in 1949 or 1950.
1950, 68 years ago.
That was a way a lot of tavern owners as well as business owners alerted authorities of a situation that was evolving. It was not out of the ordinary, apparently. So, what ended up happening was, at that time, the three people, including Michael King, were arrested. They were arrested, and an individual about 3 hours later bailed them out of jail, and they filed a complaint against the tavern owner, a civil rights violation for civil rights that they would not serve him because of the color of their skin. Now, that's virtually the total background behind the story. Now, the issue at hand is there were quite a few people who came to the forefront who basically said that this bar owner served African American people on a regular basis. Now, that's the story that is not really getting out. Now, what the issue going forth right now is within the narrative now is was the bar owner racist or was he not? And that's something that has not been determined. And the narrative that's going around now, maybe he was, but the narrative going back then was maybe he wasn't. So I would hate to have history rewritten to the detriment of an individual who cannot defend himself.
That's true.
So now, there's nothing worse than being called, well, just so you know, there's nothing worse than being called a racist, period. But in particular, there's nothing worse than being called a racist in your death, because you definitely cannot defend yourself. What's the narrative that's going around now is Martin Luther King, this was the start of his civil rights journey. This was the making of Martin Luther King Jr. That's the narrative that they want to present now. Let's not jump to conclusions as far as I'm concerned right now, because as it stands right now, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote down everything. He was a very verbal man as well as a written down man. He wrote down a lot, and just about every sermon is in writing. And he was a fine writer, as a matter of fact. So what we need to look into is in his writings, there was no mention of this incident
In Maple Shade.
In Maple Shade. And not only that, what we have to do is we have to, if he didn't put it in writing, and there's a chance that could have happened, what we need to do then is we need to talk to any civil rights activist who was alive, who knew Martin Luther King Jr., who can now come out to the forefront and say, you know what, this story was partially the basis for him getting into the civil rights movement. And if that's the case, if that is the narrative and that is the story, that is a great thing. That is absolutely a great thing. I believe in the monument that was put up in Maple Shade. There was a monument put up in Maple Shade, but the question is the narrative on that Maple Shade monument correct? We have an individual who went to Maple Shade with half the story. Okay. And basically with the police report in hand, but he did not provide them the details of the shop, of the bar owner. So as far as I'm concerned, if that is the starting place of Martin Luther King Jr. and his journey into civil rights, that place should be memorialized. It absolutely should be. But we have to get the story right. We have to get the story right for his legacy, if nothing else. And back to the home in Camden. You know what? If this is the start of his journey into the civil rights movement, if it's determined that, then that home very well may have historic significance, because when he got back home, when he got back to the place where he lived, which was that house at the time, he probably spent a couple nights there. He probably, from here and there, there's zero doubt in my mind he did not live in Camden. However, he may have spent a couple nights there. So if that is the home where he garnered all of his feelings about civil rights, then that very well may be a historically significant house. Not for the reason that he lived there, but that is the home where he grounded his roots into civil rights. If that's going to be the narrative, and maybe that home should be preserved at that point. That's all I'm saying. And what's going around right now, and we have certain people going back and forth about this home right now. And as far as I'm concerned, I am not against memorializing either spot. However, we just have to get the story right. We have to get the story right. We can't get it wrong And then in 3 or 5 years, have someone come out of the woodwork and say, "What are you talking about? You know, that bar owner was my grandpa, and you know what? I know for a fact he didn't have a prejudice bone in his body." All of a sudden, it calls into question everything involved in the story.
Right.
So we can't have that. We have to get this story right. If it has any significant historic impact, we have to get it right.
That's true, and it seems also too, Paul, that for some odd reason, a few people are now latched onto it and pushing a fake narrative, and all of a sudden there's a lot of money involved, and that's also, you can't have corruption and MLK in the same sentence.
Oh,
That's
you're
the
absolutely
problem.
right. The significant issue right now as well is, but there is monetary consideration right now, and there's $229,000 that has been lost. Now for renovation of this particular home. Now it was earmarked for renovations on this home. It was earmarked for it. Now it's gone. And my understanding, it was utilized for fire department equipment. Now, what we need to do is we need full accountability of that money, because money that's earmarked for one purpose, has to go to that purpose, period. It can't go anywhere else. So what we need to do is we need to find out what happened to that $229,000, $250,000 practically.
Taxpayer money too. We have to remember it's our money.
Exactly.
It's New Jersey residents' taxpayer money, and so it should be accounted for.
And as far as I'm concerned, if for renovation of the and renovation of the street, what we need to do, if this is determined to be historically impactful, what I'm going to ask the businesses who received money, the businesses who received money from the town in reference to tax abatements or tax credits or tax incentives for moving into Camden, because $1.6 billion was given out to businesses in Camden to move their businesses to Camden, and most of them stayed locally, including here my recommendation right now is the businesses who moved into Camden. Let's ask George Norcross and his insurance company. Let's ask Holtec. Now, these are recipients of big time money in Camden. We had Holtec receive $260 million.
Correct.
We have George Norcross, who received $256 million. We have the 76ers, who received $87 million, and we used only 57,000 of it, but right. they were targeted to receive 87 million, but they received 57 million. And we also have Subaru. Now Subaru, I'm not sure. It was somewhere over 200 million, I believe, that they received. So what we need to do is we need to ask them, since you were the recipient of quite a bit of the money, what we're going to ask you to do is we're going to ask you to come to the forefront and revitalize this street. Now, my understanding is they were trying to get $7.5 million. $7.5 million. So as far as I'm concerned, let's figure out a way now to not use taxpayer money.
Correct.
Because we already gave businesses taxpayer money. Let's ask those businesses who received that taxpayer money now to revitalize that street and revitalize an area of Camden to the benefit of Martin Luther King. Because if Martin Luther King walked the streets of Camden, that is a great thing. Yeah. So what we need to do is we need to celebrate the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And not only that, he is historically known to preach. He's historically known to preach at a church in Camden at a Baptist church. We need to erect the largest monument there, because we know for a fact that and this was just a few months. He was actually there just a few months before he died.
Right.
So what we need to do is we need to encompass his whole entire life work within the confines of Camden.
And you know, another thing too that just went through my mind, Paul. If preached at that church, there should be a trust then for that church, so that church survives.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Survives. So
Think
that
about
it's
this.
always there. It's a huge part of history.
If it is a huge part of history, and Steve, you talked about this on Saturday when we talked about it. You had no idea that Martin Luther King Jr.
No
ever
idea.
preached in Camden.
No idea.
Now, this could be a great opportunity for Camden for some type of an outreach for people within our whole entire area, whether it's Gloucester County, Camden County, Burlington County, all within a stone's throw, to make it a point to visit this church. Visit this church. And we're talking historically. You know what? He is, I would have loved to have seen him live. Unfortunately, I was born in 1968, and I did not get to see him live, but man, what a powerful voice, what a powerful message. There is not an more influential person in the 1900s than that individual in our country.
And you know, it's amazing, Paul, because I visit Washington a couple times this year, and to see the monument there, it's all inspiring. All inspiring. When you see the monument, I think coming out of the mountain, and if Camden has so much influence in his life, then to set him on this path that he chose, then
If that's determined, absolutely. If this was,
then Camden should be just like that then, and be all inspiring for the residents of Camden, the residents of New Jersey, to visit there and walk the path. The same thing when I went to Christ Church to see where George Washington had a booth there. Or that's what where they were set up back then. It was unbelievable to feel like you're that part of history, and it's so important.
You very well. Those are historically significant things where you have chills go down your back.
Yes, it was.
You know,
it
and
was
create.
unbelievable.
You know, there's nothing wrong with creating something spectacular at that church as well. Maybe creating a hologram image of Martin Luther King Jr. speaking.
Right.
You know, and that would be phenomenal. Why not? Why not? Let people hear him at that church. Maybe not one of the sermons he did. I'm sure it wasn't recorded, but you know, let's create an impactful statement that hey, he spoke here, and have him like a hologram. You know what I mean? A holographic image.
You know, because we're already at 68 years since he's been there. How long before it fades away? If we don't preserve it, if our politicians don't preserve it, if our historical societies don't preserve it, how long before it's gone? How long before you mention to the next generation? You have a young son, I have a young son. They go, I didn't know he was in Camden. I didn't know who. You know, it's important, and unfortunately, we are getting away from American history. And Martin Luther King was a huge part of American history, and we don't know half the story. And it's just wrong. And we should be, especially a local town like Camden. It should be huge for our politicians, and huge for our schools. There should be field trips there.
I agree. Yeah, I absolutely.